And more information is coming to light about the FBI's search of former President Trump's home in Mar-a-Lago on Monday. Newsweek reports that a confidential source tipped off federal agents as to what classified documents Trump was still hiding. And that informant even knew where they were located. So here to discuss it is the author of that article, Newsweek senior editor William Arkin. Thanks for joining us. So this has been very, very interesting. And of course, it sparked a lot of conversations about who would be in that inner circle, because you know it's not a large circle. What more can you tell us about this informant and how they knew that Donald Trump was hiding classified documents?
Well, this has been going on for 18 months now, this battle between the FBI and the National Archives and the Trump White House as to whether or not President Trump had stolen classified documents from the United States. And Trump camp has already returned 15 boxes, and the FBI visited Mar-a-Lago in June to express its concern that whatever was left with the president wasn't adequately secured. Something happened within this grand jury investigation and within the FBI's investigation, I know, tipped off by a human source, to indicate that President Trump was hiding additional documents and that, in fact, he was not planning to return them. These are classified documents. I don't think they have to do with anything relating to Donald Trump himself. It's more that they are intelligence documents or things of national security importance the FBI feels is important to retrieve. And that was what the Florida judge decided on Monday when he approved the search warrant.
In your article, you mentioned that the Mar-a-Lago search was deliberately timed to occur when the former president was away. I will note also that Mick Mulvaney, who was the chief of staff for President Trump for some 15 months, appeared on another network earlier this morning. I'm not sure if you saw this appearance, but he was asked directly, who could potentially have known about these documents. And he said probably only 6 or 8 people. He says that even he, as chief of staff, had no idea that there was this safe at Mar-a-Lago. So given all of that and the timing of it, why was the timing so specifically chosen?
Well, President Trump generally spends his summers at his Bedminster, New Jersey, and New York homes, and he was this summer as well. He's expected to return to Mar-a-Lago next weekend, and so the FBI clearly wanted to conduct this search while President Trump wasn't on the premises. I think the thinking on the part of the FBI was that would eliminate some of the political firestorm that has happened as a result. And in fact, the FBI was present at the House. My understanding is today, they were present at the House for some hours before anyone even knew in the public that they were there. So the FBI, in fact, could have pulled off a quiet search warrant, but in fact, they didn't. As for the question of who would know what's in the safe, there's another possibility that you're not paying attention to, which is that the CIA or the intelligence community itself might know what's in the safe, that they know that they gave to President Trump certain documents and that, in fact, they hadn't been returned.
Oh, that's really fascinating.
Intriguing.
Yeah, it really is. What more insight can you give us into the FBI's planning of this search? Clearly, it would take sort of high-level approval. So can you give us anything else?
Well, it seems to me that we need to understand as well that the FBI is far from being any kind of a perfect agency. They've bungled these kinds of operations in the past. And in fact, the FBI has acted independently of the Attorney General and independently of the White House. I don't think that the FBI has a very good read on the American public. I think we saw that on January 6th during the insurrection. And so now to give the FBI too much credit would probably be reading into it our dreams about what the FBI is as opposed to the reality of what the FBI is. And I think that that's going to be part of the story as we move forward. And that is, were the documents that were retrieved from Mar-a-Lago commensurate with this unprecedented act of going into the home of a former president, something that has never been done in American history?
This is why you need your journalists. Like that's a great question to ask.
It is an important
because I think you're right. We have been making the assumption that it must have been high-level, very important documents for them to take this step. I've been intrigued by the history of the FBI, and I've asked most guests who appear on our air to sort of help our audience understand this. You make some excellent points there about the history of the FBI, and in fact, I raised it earlier this morning when we had an attorney, a former prosecutor, on our air. That in the past, and I'm specifically talking about the period of the FBI under Director Hoover, there was a documentary that came out, and through Freedom of Information requests that have showed that the FBI, for example, sent a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King anonymously asking him to kill himself, that they specifically targeted civil rights leaders. And that's just one example of what the FBI is accused of having done in its past. But there was an understanding that in the post-Hoover era, that they had tried to clean up the Bureau, that for the most part, most of the agents that were there were hardworking, agents who wanted to do good. But you still say that there is perhaps, and we saw it at the very highest levels during the last 5 years with the controversies around Director Comey and Peter Strzok and other agents who for whatever reasons there was controversy around their politics. But you say we should still keep a jaundiced eye on what the FBI is doing.
Well, let's just take January 6th as an example. The FBI is the highest federal law enforcement agency that we have. And on January 6th, FBI intelligence did not anticipate the size of the crowd. They did not anticipate a march on the Capitol or an attempt to take control of the Capitol. And this really gives you an indication of the fact that really one of the things that the FBI is most flawed about is that it doesn't have a good understanding of the American people. And when James Comey came before the American people just days before the 2016 election and essentially said that Hillary Clinton had broken the law, I mean, the FBI put a finger on the scale of what those elections would be like. And today as well, with this search warrant at the Trump Mar-a-Lago home on Monday, we do see, again, the FBI doing something that is going to have an enormous political reverberation across our country. And so we shouldn't be looking at the FBI as merely a neutral player. What it does in the public sphere, what it does with a former president, and particularly what it does against Donald Trump, it had better produce the goods, or else it's going to actually have an impact on people voting in the 2024 election.
Let me ask you a question. You said, for the past 18 months, the National Archives, they've been talking with Trump's people, his attorneys, and 15 boxes of documents had been returned. What has because why does he have 15 boxes that need to be returned? What has the former president said about how these materials have been handled?
Well, what he said is, oh gosh, the movers took the wrong boxes and we're happy to return them. But I think what's more important is understanding that it is the case that presidents have access to their papers after they leave office. In fact, they're essential for the writing of biographies. They're essential for historical reasons. They're essential because, in fact, they may be personal papers that belong to Donald Trump. And there is a distinction in the law between what is a personal paper and what is government property. So it's not so much devious per se that the Trump White House had documents that were in question as to whether or not they belong to the National Archives or they belong to Donald Trump. In January of this year, they conceded that these 15 boxes of documents belonged to the National Archives and returned them. I think that what has happened since then is that there has been additional information that has come forward. And again, let's remember, there's been a grand jury investigation into whether or not there was lawbreaking involved here. And evidently, the FBI came to the conclusion, the grand jury itself, the U.S. attorney, the FBI came to the conclusion that there, in fact, had been a potential violation of the law, which I think they would have had to have told the Florida magistrate in order to get an approval for a search warrant. I mean, the first question the Florida magistrate is going to ask is, we've never done this in 250 years. Are you telling me that you know what the documents are and you know where they are? That is to say, I have to approve that the documents, you know enough to know that the documents exist and that you know that they are at Mar-a-Lago. And so those two facts would have had to have been established for the judge to approve the search warrant. And so I think we know a lot less about what it is that exactly is that the FBI knew and what they were looking for. And that's where the confidential human source comes in, that in fact, somebody in the Trump camp was aware of the fact that President Trump kept a safe, and that in that safe were documents that perhaps he was not going to return, even as after this whole tussle between the National Archives and the Trump White House had been resolved. And that, to me, is the basis for which we saw the raid on Monday.
Really quickly, William, before we let you go, you probably no doubt saw the statement from the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, and other Republicans, and there was one specifically directed at Attorney General Merrick Garland, something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing here, clear your calendar, because the assumption being that if Republicans do take control of the House in November, that, they're going to haul them up to Capitol Hill to answer questions around this. So what are you learning about whether the Attorney General, because you said something earlier that maybe I misheard you, but that the Biden administration, President Biden himself, and the Attorney General may not have been working in conjunction. The Biden administration says they had no forward advance warning of this. But what are you learning about whether or not Merrick Garland knew or didn't know what was happening?
I reported in Newsweek yesterday that the Attorney General did not know the details about the search, that he was aware of the investigation. He was briefed on the affidavit on the part of the U.S. Attorney and the FBI special agent in Miami, and that he was generally aware of what was going on, but that he was not asked for permission to conduct the search itself. And I still believe that that's true, that Garland was not asked as to whether or not the search should take place, because if he says yes, then everybody pins it on Garland as opposed to pinning it on the facts. And if he says no, obviously, then it's a scandal as well. So in order to insulate Garland and in order to make this purely a law enforcement function, my understanding is he was not privy to the details of the search itself.
All right, William Arkin, excellent reporting. Thank you for sharing it with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me on.